Okay, so now let's keep the conversation going. One of the last topics we were talking about was the legislature. And Brian, you had mentioned that, the governor with term limits, it sort of gives governors now extraordinary power. And, we're in the last year of Gavin Newsom's tenure as governor. I've read a couple articles today about how he's flexing his muscle, right? And whipping the legislature in shape to address his priority issues. And the speculation is a lot of these priority issues are sort of built around his future presidential run. And my assumption is if that's the case, right, he's going to need to try to figure out how to moderate a little more, especially when he's trying to sell, you know, himself to the Midwest, voters in the heartland. Do you think we'll see maybe a, a policy shift coming out of the governor in like next session, his last legislative session, and an opening to address some of these sort of sticky issues that, the legislature hasn't been willing to address? There's there optimism there? Jennifer, the way you're like, I don't know about that.
Well, I mean, I think again, we there from where Governor Newsom started to where he is today, I think is definitely different, with regards to his engagement on some of these policies. And even the four of us know, going through the PAGA exercise, that it was really the governor's office, you know what I mean, that kind of pushed those negotiations along and made that reform happen where others had, previously tried and failed. So I think that's a reflection of kind of his engagement on things and really driving that moderate discussion between different interest groups that, necessarily wouldn't have found common ground before. I think, as we look into the next year, again, going on the affordability, one of the things that is top of mind that I'm thinking about is, of course, our state budget and the challenges that we're going to be under next year, given the predictions and forecasts that we are going to be hitting some rocky times with regards to a budget deficit, given there was already, expectations that we were going to be in a deficit, but I think the size now, given some of the policies coming down from the federal level, specifically in the healthcare space, it could be quite significant. And so how do you balance a budget when they already, you know what I mean, did some cuts last year to address the anticipated deficit, and having to do more cuts, which we know brings in a ton of interest groups who are feeling those cuts and don't want to see those cuts to the programs happen. Of course, the natural on one side is to say, well, let's just go find more revenue, and that impacts the affordability discussion that we were having on the last session. With regards, you keep raising costs on businesses, those costs ultimately are reflected in consumer prices and higher prices for residents of California. And so, I think he is going to be faced with that challenge. And so far, he has been the one holding the line for the last several years to say, I'm not increasing taxes. I'm not increasing taxes. There was, a proposal I remember coming out of the Senate that was really looking to increase the corporate tax here in California. There's been discussions, on services tax, as you know, across the board for so many years on implementing that. So I just think, that again, his engagement over the years has certainly shown, different opportunities for there to be moderate middle ground approaches. And on the tax side, he has been the one who's been holding the line. And so optimistic that as we head into, this budget session, that he will look for other ways in which to deal with the potential deficit than raising taxes in California.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the growth of our budget, I think I don't know if it was 10 years or 15 years, but it's doubled, right? And so the massive expansion of government, the largest growth in jobs in California has been government jobs, right? So you got to think that there's some Doge-like project that, ought to be implemented, if we run into tough times. Yeah, then a new governor who's coming in is going to inherit, right? Some some difficult budget years, unlike I think when Gavin Newsom was elected, things were pretty good, and so we inherited a pretty good economy. And the next governor is likely to inherit, you know, I got I got to come in here my first year and start slashing, or maybe not increasing taxes. Either way, there's going to be a bunch of angry people.
Yeah, and just I know Dave and Brian are going to jump in, but when you talked earlier too about, a third of the legislature being new, I mean, I can assure you none of them came up with the idea that they were going to have to make, you know what I mean, significant budget cuts. And so that's a really hard position for them to be in as new legislators. And now I'm cutting programs or, significant programs for my constituents. It's tough. Those are tough decisions.
Yeah, yeah. Brian, Dave,
Yeah,
anyone?
I was listening to Jennifer, I was just thinking a little bit about this. And if you're on the governor's political team, you got to be thinking ahead about 25 steps. And so one of the narratives that has taken hold, and the governor's team has done a lot to try and fight it. I would argue not that successfully, but it's the flight of people from California. We had a net increase, I think, in our population last year after a couple of years of decrease, not by much. And we're going to lose one or two congressional seats in the next census probably. But I don't really think that's the data point that matters. I think the data point that matters are two things. One, what is the increase of bodies leaving California, right? What's the percentage increase in the last, call it 4 years, 6 years? It's significant. Don't know off the top of my head, but it's significant. And then even more importantly, who are they? Because I guarantee you 90+% of those people are taxpayers. And I think that's a narrative that's going to carry nationally. It already has. And I think that's going to be hard for the governor. I think he's going to have to come to terms with that question somehow, some way. And as I said, they've been trying to fight that narrative to the mat. I just don't think that they've been very successful yet. And maybe they'll find a way. But all that goes to, again, the question about affordability. It's been a rhetorical point, as Brian said earlier. We're waiting for the actions, but the actions have got to come very quickly because people are making economic life decisions in high numbers, and fleeing the state. And it's not just the ultra wealthy. There's plenty of data if you look at PPIC and some other sources that it is working class folks who have just given up, which I think is sad and it's tragic. And I don't really know how any legislator or any elected leader can get up in the morning and accept that. I just think, your kitchen's on fire. You should get after it. And so it's a little more than a little frustrating that so far the affordability discussion has been rhetorical to me, mostly, with a couple of some narrow exceptions. But I think that narrative about the flight of taxpayers in California, that's a real thing, and business relocation, that's a real thing. And as he goes around the country, if he does mount to campaign for president, I think that's going to be one of the themes that's going to be front and center for him.
Yeah, and usually their answer is, just look at, we're the fourth largest economy. Look at the GDP and the numbers, of course, that are all inflated by out of Silicon Valley, right? And now AI, and if there's an AI bubble that bursts, it's going to get ugly. Brian, any observations on that?
Yeah, I would say, it's been a theme of our discussion last time and this time. Affordability matters. And, you're not going to stay in California if you're a middle class person and you can't buy an $850,000 average home. I mean, it's not feasible, particularly when you go somewhere else and buy one for half or even less than half the cost and get a similar job in some other location. Even though our weather's great, our resources are great, it's a fantastic place to be, live, and work. But at some point, you got to say, I can't support my family here. And then the ripple effects, well, if I can't afford a house, I probably can't afford a car either. Or I'm not going to buy, the more expensive exotic produce. Maybe I'm not going to buy produce at all, or I can't go to a restaurant, or, what have you. So I think figuring out and doing aggressive strategies to combat the affordability crisis is going to be key for the governor in the next 15 or so months he's got left in his term, because he's going to have to change the narrative of exodus of people and jobs elsewhere, to say, no, people want to come to California because it's a great place to be. And there's a lot more to be done there.
Yeah, he needs to change the narrative quickly for the Iowa caucus voters.
Yeah, and I say that as a much like Dave's members, you don't move a farm in Oxnard to Vegas, and you don't move a car dealership in Los Angeles to Phoenix. They're there. We have a vested interest in making sure California works, and figuring out affordability is key to all of that.
Yeah, huge for us too. I mean, same thing with restaurants. You don't see restaurants saying, "I'm going to leave the state. I'm going to move my operations to Phoenix." That just doesn't happen. But when people leave the state, they're our customers. When when large manufacturing firms or warehousing operations move to a more affordable state, those are customers to restaurants. So we feel the impact of that flight, even though that may not even be our industry.
Jot, can I jump in and just add something to start to that conversation on the leaving piece? I think one of the other key metrics that we need to be looking at, other than the who's leaving the state versus coming in the state, one of the consistent themes that we have heard from our member companies as well is that they are not necessarily leaving California it's the fourth largest economy in the world. It's a huge market. They're not leaving California, but they are choosing not to expand operations here. So I think that's another metric that really needs to be evaluated because we are losing out on those opportunities as well. And that is, again, going back to the affordability issue. It's just too costly to do any expansion here. So that's another key point that I just wanted to add to that conversation.
Yeah, I want to second that. I've got member companies, multi-generational family farmers who have, through a lot of hard work, have built successful farming enterprises in California who are investing in other states, Georgia, Florida, places they didn't think they could grow their particular crop. I'm not going to name names, but California being a Mediterranean climate, only 1 of 5 in the world, it's a great place to grow fresh produce, fresh vegetables and fruits and tree nuts. But it's not the only place. And when the economic stress becomes too great, people will find a way. And they're finding ways in other states and other countries. And so you're right, Jennifer, we see the same thing. Although we do have a declining number of farms in California, declining acreage, then that's obviously, the product of extremely high cost of operations versus other competing states and countries. But we also see exactly what you said, that we have these established farming enterprises that are making investment decisions outside of California.
Yeah, I can't tell you how many restaurant operators that I've talked to who have maybe, 5 or 6 restaurants and want to expand. They'll always say, never in California. We'll expand somewhere else in another state if it works. And then I've talked to a ton of executives from national brands who aren't in California, but they're curious, they're looking, and I tell them what it's like to operate a business in California. We'll expand to the west as far as the Nevada and Arizona, California border. That's as far as we're going. Changing subjects and sort of using what the GDP is, look at the GDP of California, look at our economy is sort of like the response that a lot of people have when you talk about flight. And Steve Hilton, who's running for governor, which is sort of the pivot, he's talked to my board. We've heard from about half of the gubernatorial candidates, and our goal is to hear from all of them before election day. We're going to hear from Katie Porter and hopefully Becerra this coming November, and then hear from the rest in April. But I think Steve Hilton points out, yeah, you can look at fourth largest economy in the world, but when you look at the people who are being left out in the middle class and the growing, chasm between the haves and the have-nots, fourth largest economy in the world doesn't mean a thing when you can't afford rent or a car. I'm curious what you guys think about the field of gubernatorial candidates. I'm not asking for your position on any. I find them all interesting, and many of them have strong qualities, to lead. What do you think about the current field, and what do you think about sort of this discussion about? Are you hearing about Senator Padilla maybe considering? Rick Caruso, is sort of flirting with the idea. It seems like. Any thoughts on is the field going to expand, or is it going to contract?
I think both. I think it'll expand and contract. Yeah, I mean, my perspective, it's a wide open race, and that's why I think you're seeing so many people considering it and who have jumped in so far and are considering, jumping in. Obviously, we had Tony Atkins in there before, and she stepped out. But again, I think you'll see either rumors or I actually think that more will jump into this race before, you know what I mean, we get much further along to the primary. But I also think you'll contract. I think if you see some others jump in and those numbers change, you'll see some exit the race. But it's a wide open race. And, I don't think that's been the case for the last, couple of gubernatorial elections. So everybody's kind of throwing their hat in at this point.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, I kind of echo what Jen said. It's the second most important political job behind the president. Um, in some ways, it's harder than being president. You have to balance your budget. You don't have to do that at the federal level. And you can't make foreign policy here, although many governors have tried. I think the crop of candidates we have is a good one. I think the candidates who might be looking at the race would add to the conversation and the debate. But, bottom line is we got to make California governable, and we have to address the issues we've been talking about in the prior episode and this one. You got to make this place affordable, and you got to make it a place where people are willing and able to stay and earn a living and raise their families here. And the governor needs to be laser focused on that. And those are the kind of questions our dealers are going to be asking of them.
Yeah, I echo that. We've had interaction with most of them, not all of them, and a couple of points. I think, to Brian's point, the tone, certainly the Democratic Party, obviously in the Republican Party, around affordability is reaching kind of a crescendo. But to our earlier conversation, the last episode, I think it's incumbent upon all of us who represent the private sector economy to press these candidates to do more than mouth the words. Tell us exactly what you're going to do. Commit to it here and now, that you're not going to just talk about affordability. You're going to enact policy, and it's going to tick off some of the constituent groups in your party if you do it right. Can you commit to that and hold them accountable? And because I think it's a lot easier to run for office than it is to govern. And so the rhetoric is great. I would just caution not to be lulled into a false sense of security by hearing candidates tell you what they know you want to hear, unless you really press them hard. The other thing I'd say that's interesting regarding the field currently is that we're in mid-October, so it doesn't feel like it's getting close, but it is getting kind of close. And it's interesting to me how little money they've raised. This is one of those situations where I look at the funds raised by the candidates, and it just screams for either a Senator Padilla, who I presume would be able to bring a lot of donors in very quickly, or even more likely, the way California does things, a self-funded candidate, a very wealthy candidate. And I think that is, as every month goes by, if the fundraising levels don't pick up dramatically for some of these candidates, I think someone with a big bank account who has political aspirations, is going to be tempted and will jump in.
Yeah. Well, we were all in for Caruso for mayor in LA, and he sure makes a lot of sense, when you're talking to him about solutions. And, in many respects, he's kind of like Daniel Lurie in San Francisco. And I'm telling you, the impression that I get from our industry in San Francisco is that this guy's a real deal, right? He's had a very successful life before he got elected to, the mayoralship of San Francisco. Basically said, I love this place. I want to fix it. And then I'm going to go back to my other life. I don't have a political career. I don't have a future after this. Don't want it. Those are the same kind of talking points or sort of sentiments that we heard from Rick Caruso when he's running for mayor. Maybe you need somebody like that. And so if he's got the resources to get elected governor, maybe it's time for a change in terms of the background of a governor. But the graveyard is full of billionaires who self-fund. Al Checky, Simon, Meg Whitman. There's a whole bunch of rich people who've spent a ton of money to get elected, and the voters just go, I'm not buying it, So I don't know. I don't know if you subscribe to this, and I don't know if I do either, but I was talking to, a very astute, longtime political observer, and he said, voters, some voters always want change. Voters, whether it's in California or anywhere, they typically vote for change. And you can also, look at, the temperament and the sort of the type of governor you have that is always switching back and forth between sort of flashy and very looking for the headline, always, top of the news story, and then kind of boring, but roll up your sleeves and do the work, not looking for the headline, kind of like a Daniel Lurie type of figure. And he goes, think about it. Gavin Newsom, very flashy, captures a lot of attention. Before him, Jerry Brown, kind of boring. Wasn't really, before Jerry Brown, Arnold Schwarzenegger, very flashy, a lot of attention. Before him, Gray Davis, I'm like, okay, so now I'm looking at, okay, what candidates are boring in the field? Maybe, appeal to the voters. And there's a number of them.
It's good. It's a good analysis.
Yeah. I don't know if I buy into it if it's just a coincidence, but I go, oh, it makes sense because it is true that voters usually vote for change when things aren't going great. It kind of feels like that now. So, we'll see. Okay, so let's close it out with, because you three were instrumental in PAGA reform. And Brian, you have been on PAGA reform on behalf of your members for many years, and you drove that reform from the very beginning. And so on behalf of the restaurant industry, thank you for being such a leader on that issue. And obviously Dave and Jennifer, we were kind of a team really on the initiative front, on the PAGA reform front, and all the work that went on. And Jennifer, you were the one that really at the end were spending so much time shuttle diplomacy with lots of lawyers on each side, trying to get to a deal. And, I think hats off to the governor for doing what he did. But how do you, it may be too early to score to sort of how it's working. And Brian, you and I talked a couple weeks ago about it, and I think you're still feeling pretty good about it. And you get calls from, other organizations that are sort of, phoning it in most cases, or weren't part of the process or didn't want to get involved, in the initiative process, saying, it wasn't the reform that we should have gotten. Of course, well, never is in the legislative process when you're negotiating. And then, of course, you hear from people who go, I just got another PAGA suit, or I'm still fighting a PAGA suit. Brian, you said, well, is it from before June or after June? So I have been talking to a lot of restaurateurs that have been saying, yeah, I'm still dealing with this PAGA, issue. And I ask them, is it from before June or after June? And most of them, it's before June, So any observations on, what you're seeing and hearing from your members on the PAGA front?
Yeah, I'll start off and let Dave and Jen weigh in too. We're only about 15 months in since the reform took effect, and these things take time. As your members are telling you, Jot, and I'm sure the rest of our members are telling us, they're still dealing with PAGA lawsuits that were filed 2, 3, 4 years ago. They're still sort of making their way through the process, and the liability in those cases is based on the old PAGA, not the new PAGA. I am heartened by the fact that the labor agency is doing the job that the PAGA reform gave them to stand between plaintiffs in these cases and the businesses that we represent, and weigh in on some of these cases and say they're frivolous. I just had a dealer lawyer send me a letter within the last week. The labor agency basically slapped down a serial plaintiff and said, you can't do this behavior under the new PAGA, wouldn't let a claim proceed. So I'm optimistic that the reform is going to move the needle significantly. It wasn't a repeal, though, so there's still PAGA, and there's still going to be PAGA cases filed. But our goal was to make it better than it was before, and I think we accomplished that.
Yeah, I'd just say from our perspective, a lot of member feedback, sort of our desired outcome, I think, the four of us, was to reduce both the number and severity of PAGA cases. And I would say from the feedback we've had from our members, the severity has definitely been reduced. Again, if you're post June 19th of 2024, the severity of the cases is dramatically reduced, especially for employers who did the smart things that the law now allows them to protect against a shakedown lawsuit. Still a question in my mind about the number, however. We still have some of our members telling us that they're being hit with a fairly steady stream, put it that way, of PAGA cases. Tend to be the larger employers. They're settling out faster and for lower amounts. I'm pretty confident of that. But I think we need data, good data, rather than just anecdotal information to make a judgment on how it has worked so far, and as the law continues to mature, how we can continue to help employers take maximum advantage of the law's protections, and then have an eye towards anything else we might be able to do via the legislature. But I think we've all been around this long enough. When you have a large deal compromise like this, a large legislative compromise like this, nobody wants to touch it again for quite a long time. And so I'm confident we have a really good work product. Credit to Jen for negotiating with the governor's office and with the folks on the other side of the table to get us that great work product. But again, I think for our goal was to reduce number and severity. I've got a lot of confidence in reducing severity, and I think the jury's out on the number.
Yeah, I'll add on to, I agree with both what Brian and Dave just said, similar comments from our members. I have seen those letters from the agency, and so it is great to see, you know what I mean, the agency engaging and doing what we anticipated, and stopping some of these serial filers from continuing with these kitchen sink complaints, you know what I mean, that basically just alleged everything and tried to move forward. I have heard from our members that I agree with Dave. I don't know if the numbers necessarily have, you know what I mean, declined, but the type of cases have changed. And so you see much more narrow, more limited cases being filed. They're not, again, that kitchen sink that we had been seeing for prior to June impacts. And so the type of claim is changing, the type of case is changing. And then the penalty caps that we put into place, if again an employer is doing the right thing, are having the impact that we hoped with regards to really driving down the settlement value of a lot of these cases. So that part is optimistic. I think one of the other pieces that I am really excited and happy to see, because it impacts all of those small employers, is the true right to cure that was created under the reforms through the agency for those smaller employers. I think I saw a recent post by the agency that said they had collected over $900,000 wages through that right to cure, which you think, oh my gosh, you know what I mean, that's a lot of money. But those are all cases that were previously going to court and going and getting litigated with attorneys' fees, and now they're being handled and resolved through that right to cure through the agency. And so again, from my perspective, that's a huge, you know what I mean, success, especially for our smaller employers who don't have the resources to go and fight these cases in court, and we're getting leveraged for ridiculous settlement demands.
Yeah. Well, thank you to all of you for joining us on our podcast, and appreciate the time. It was a good conversation. Appreciate it.
Nice to see you guys.
Good to see you.